So moving on, we're going to go into the build plate adhesion tab, and this is a really important section about how your printed object is actually going to be sticking to the base. Does it need any assistance, or is it just fine on its own? Generally, you're talking about what is the surface area on the bottom of the print versus how tall is it. If you're printing a really tall, skinny object, then it may be fine at the very beginning, but as it gets to the very top, the nozzle is actually pulling your part just a little bit, and it may fall over and then your print's failed. So in certain scenarios, you may want to increase the surface area of your very first layer, or you may not whatsoever. So we'll be discussing all those different values. We generally have 4 different things that we can adjust, whether we don't need any build plate adhesion, a skirt, a raft, or a brim. Now these are really common terminologies that I come across all the time on 3D printing forums, and people go, what is it? What do I need? Which one do I choose? What's the point? And so we'll demystify a little bit of that today. So the most boring one, none. This is saying when I print this, I don't need any help whatsoever. I've got absolutely nothing going on the very first layer other than exactly what is printing on the first layer. Everything else is just fine. As I then go into needing a little bit of help, then I can go and add a skirt to my print. Now a skirt is basically just adding a little line all the way around the very first layer of my print. You can see it here in blue. And this isn't super useful for a very small object, but it's very essential for the very large object. The idea is that if I have a large print and I don't know if my bed is very level, then I can print that bed leveling G-code, all those squares that we have. But when I get to a larger print, or if I'm kind of in a bit of a rush, I don't want to have to run 2 separate prints. If I can avoid it, I will just print this little border that goes all the way around my print, and I can use that as a really quick way to move all of my wheels, and so it will level my bed perfectly. So by the time it starts on my print, everything looks good to go. I've said, hey, I really don't need that much material because my bed is already pretty perfect. So I'll say, yeah, I only need a couple lines all the way around, and I don't need a huge amount of distance away from my print. So if we hit play, then it's going to be printing all the way around, and this gives me a good amount of time to start leveling my bed, and then it will go and start to work on the very first layer. This is a great option if you know that your first layer has got a good amount of surface adhesion and you just want to have a little hack built into it. But let's say that you actually don't have a ton of surface area. Let's say that you are printing something that has only a couple small points touching on the bed, but your print is actually still pretty tall. Well, then you may want to consider using a brim or a raft. We'll talk about a brim first. It's a little bit easier. A brim basically extends the first layer outwards. It adds kind of like a brim of a hat. So every other layer of my print is perfectly normal except for this first layer. And what this does is it adds a huge amount of surface area that's actually built into my part, so that as soon as I am done with my 3D object, I can take it off my build plate and I just kind of break off the brim all the way around. It's a very easy process. You may need to grab a little X-Acto blade and just kind of clean it up a little bit, but generally it gives you a really fantastic surface quality on the bottom layer, but you have a lot of post-processing associated with it. And you're really just saying, okay, what is the distance from my object to the very edge? I've said 10 millimeters, I believe that's stock, but that's always worked for me. But then let's say you don't want to deal with any post-processing whatsoever, then you will want to choose a raft. Now a raft is a sacrificial bit of material, it is purely temporary, and it builds up a few layers just below your object, and then a little air gap, and then it will start on the rest of your print. What this means is that that air gap works in a very similar way to the support material, where you just have a little bit of a drooping first layer, so your raft can actually peel off very easily, but you still have the surface area that will kind of guarantee a very good first layer. So as you can see, we have more surface area on the very bottom. I don't have a very large margin. We could increase that to 10 millimeters to match the brim, so we have just as much kind of grabbing power. And on the underside, you can see it builds up line after line after line. But if I can get the camera right on angle, you can see there is in fact an air gap in between the two layers. So this very first layer, instead of printing, well, floating midair, it's going to droop down just a little bit and touch in some small points so that it will give you a better quality, well, down the line. So if you're in a situation where you don't know what to pick, where you go, I don't know whether to choose a skirt, brim, or raft, it's a good question to ask a few different questions to see what you actually need. If you know that your part has got a good amount of surface area and it's not all that tall, and you know your bed is really level, then you can just click none. If you know your bed is a little bit out of level, then you may want to print a skirt. If you know that you're printing a very large object or it doesn't have a lot of surface area on the bottom, then you're going to want to choose brim or a raft. And now it's personal preference whether you don't want to have to deal with any post-processing and you don't care if the first layer of your object looks very good or very bad, then you can use a raft. But if you know you want to have a good aesthetic first layer to your print, then you'll want to choose a brim. So moving on from the build plate adhesion, the next tab is dual extrusion. And weirdly enough, this is a tab that you can't get rid of, but if you try and click and expand it, you'll notice that there are no settings inside of it. And that is because we have a 3D printer that only has one nozzle. There are other 3D printers that have 2 or sometimes 4 nozzles within them, so they can print multi-colors at the same time, or you can print multi-materials at the same time. That's a much more advanced 3D printer that we really won't touch on today. But there are settings associated with it, so if you do end up investing all that money in a special 3D printer that can do 2 colors or more at the same time, then all your settings will be in there. But we're going to continue on to mesh fixes. And mesh fixes is really where you're associating your 3D object with the quality of the real world. So when you have an STL, stereolithography, which is the 3D file for most 3D printed objects, it's going to look like a bunch of polygons. If we go back into prepare, we can look at this very, very high quality tugboat, and we have to zoom in a lot to actually see all the small polygons associated with it. If we go to something that has a lower quality print that may have a fewer amount of polygons, then it's going to be very, very blocky and rigid. But because it has smaller amounts of polygons, it means it's a smaller file, which means it can open and you can process it much, much faster. But if you make your quality of your object too high, it's just unnecessary. If you are working with a tool that can only print an accuracy of about, well, 1/100th of a millimeter, and you have your 3D object as 1,000th of a millimeter, and you're going, oh, this is taking so long to load, yeah, it's unnecessary. There's no need to have such a high quality amount of data associated with a file. You may as well just work around it. In fact, if you have an object like this and you slice it and it's so high quality, and you actually look at one of the layers that it's moving, and you take a look at the nozzle, then as it's printing, what's happening is there's a processor inside the motherboard, and it's trying to keep up with all of these tiny, minuscule polygons. And unfortunately, every once in a while, it may get overwhelmed with just how much data it has to process per second, and it stalls for a second and then goes, oh, okay, I can figure this out, and then continues onwards. But in real life, that means the nozzle is stalling. It means for a very short amount of time, the nozzle is moving, stops, still squirting out plastic, and then it continues onwards. And this can result with a lot of surface defects known as nerds or bubbles or zits, and it's just small little defects on your print that you really don't want to have to deal with. So what we can do is say, hey, I know exactly how accurate my machine is with a mesh fix. There's a YouTuber called CNC Kitchen, which I highly, highly recommend. He is a aeronautic engineer that kind of specializes in 3D printing, and he does really deep dive in the engineering aspects of 3D printing. Highly, highly recommend it. And he has a very, very fantastic video on just this process, where we have really 3 values that we can mess around with, where we have maximum resolution, maximum travel resolution, and maximum deviation. And this is all about how is that processor dealing with all of those very small little steps that you have within a 3D part. And with this maximum resolution, we're basically saying we're limiting the smallest polygon that it can possibly move is 0.5 millimeter. That's all I care about, that's just fine. With this setting, we're actually reducing the amount of data per second the processor has to deal with, and so it can be much more efficient, and it's very, very unlikely that's ever going to stall while it's moving. Very, very similar aspect for the travel resolution. We have both of these as 0.5 millimeters. But for the maximum deviation, which is the difference, is how far is it moving in relation to those printed objects, I only want it to deviate just a little bit from an accurate value. We've set this to 0.05 millimeters because we still want to have an accurate part, but we just don't want to have a ton of data associated. So having these values set in will give you a much better quality on your print without risking having too low of a quality of your part.